But there was also something that often comes with charismatic movements, a kind of chaotic state of affairs, which has not entirely been corrected. In other words, certain of basic doctrinal positions were never fully developed in Mennonitism. And as I experience it, are waiting to be developed. That's part of my interest in our conversation. But it was very clearly a popular movement, charismatically inspired. Its most distinctive claim, its organizing principle, was its understanding of the church. So it was not a charismatic movement in the sense of a preoccupation with individual religious experience, but grounded in the life of the church, which was the medium of grace, in a certain sense. I think one could say that. And it was not baptism in and of itself, by which Mennonites are most known, but baptism as a symbolic expression of how they understood the church. Another question that has received a lot of attention in Protestantism as a whole, and that is, the way it was put in the 16th century, is the finite capable of bearing the infinite. I'm on page 4, if you find it helpful to follow. And this was highlighted by a debate between Zwingli and Luther. And Zwingli's argument, who was one of the most radical of the reformers, he was so concerned with the problem of idolatry in the Catholic Church that he accepted a principle that had already been debated before the Reformation. And he said, no, the finite is not capable of bearing the infinite. In other words, outward forms can never fully mediate inward reality. Luther was on the other side of that debate and emphatically said yes, that was possible. And in relation to this kind of a debate, Luther and Zwingli would probably be the two polar figures. Now, in their understanding of the church, the Anabaptists went with the longer tradition, which had answered yes to this question. In other words, that outward forms can mediate inward reality. The church is the body of Christ. Salvation is found in the church. In other words, historically, that this is being challenged now, but historically, until very recently, Mennonites have always held to the view that when someone is baptized, they are baptized simultaneously into a local congregation and into the universal church. That you cannot simply be baptized, as is the case in some denominations. Because even though you come to Christ personally, salvation is found in the church. So there is, if you like, a sacramental principle as regards the church. If we think of the sacrament is an outer form that mediates an inward reality. But as I go on to say in this paper, that because of, I don't want to make generalizations about the Catholic Church. All I can say is that the kind of people who were attracted to Anabaptism had experienced a lifelessness in Catholic pastoral life. In other words, they were searching for something life-giving that they had not found. That doesn't mean that all Catholic Church life was like that, but that in some settings it was. And people reacted so strongly to sacramental forms that had not been life-giving to them, that they were very reluctant to continue any of those claims for the sacraments. And so they talked about the Lord's Supper. I give examples here with Balthasar Hubmaier and Dirk Phillips and then Pilgrim Marpeck, who represent three different kinds of sacramental thought. They were very reluctant to grant this. And I'll just sort of establish that point for the moment, because I see it as very important, and then go into slightly more detail when I look at their writing in particular. It can be said in general, in relation to the Eucharist, that the emphasis was on the transformation of the people and not of the elements. And I'd be very interested in discussing that further. Does that seem like an artificial distinction, or does it make some sense? In my own studies and in my ecumenical involvements, I wanted to, on about the middle of page 5, I wanted to use Pilgrim Marpeck, why I find him so valuable, to talk about a principle that I think is extremely important in this conversation. And I'm starting in the middle of the third full paragraph. Marpeck's originality lay in his ability to see that if the spiritualistic impulse, which most parts of the Reformation had welcomed as a corrective to the externality of much late medieval piety, if that became the norm for Christian belief and practice, it would negate the reality and meaning of the Incarnation. And that has dawned on me ever more. The tendency that we have, and that I think is particularly strong in American Christianity, is to put almost the entire weight on inner experience. That it is that which validates the authenticity and truth of something. And it seems to me that that approach, taken to its conclusion, runs into very dangerous territory. In other words, it ends up saying that the Incarnation wasn't necessary. That one can find God and live in God in an entirely inward sense. And Marpeck says things like that God condescended to us as creatures of flesh and blood and came to us on our terms. In other words, it's an acknowledgement that because we are creatures of flesh and blood, we apprehend reality in a physical sense as well as a spiritual sense. So the stakes are high here, and I would say many forms of free church Protestantism who would dogmatically affirm the Incarnation are in danger of pushing it to the side. I'll just make the briefest of comments here in case you want to make reference to this later. One of the most articulate and prolific authors among the Anabaptists was Balthasar Hubmaier, who was a sort of an odd Anabaptist in that he did not accept the common Anabaptist interpretation of the love of enemies, and that he had a place for defensive warfare. So he's not entirely typical, but he's very articulate and typical of a certain stream, the more Swiss and South German stream, in which baptism is essential to salvation. He says that completely explicitly, but it is essential